He's the writer of a military history from from Osman to Ataturk and I'm trying to hold up the book right here so you can see it for yourself. He is Mesut Uyar. I hope I said the name correctly. And I always try to ask in the beginning of the podcast, to get to know the guests a little bit. How did you get interested in the Ottoman Army and the military side of the Ottoman Empire?
Well, once upon a time, I was a professional military officer. History was always my area of interest, and I tried to blend history with my profession. But initially, instead of getting history academic education, I prefer to get a politics master's and international relations PhD. So my real area of expertise is and previously was war studies. So war studies makes use of military history to understand the current affairs and to predict what will happen in the future. So by using military history as a database, they create theories or test their theories. So initially I was planning to work on current conflicts and what the future wars would be. But instead of using readily available Western databases, I decided to make use of Turkish military history in order to make a difference, and which is also an area of interest of me. But unfortunately, when I got into the Turkish history books, I found out that they are not useful as a database, not providing the numbers, not providing the data I was looking for. So I decided to create my own database, mining the data from the archives, and in the meantime, learning the Ottoman script. Before 1928, the Turks were using Arabic letters to write down Turkish, and for modern Turkish people, it is not possible to read the old texts before 1928. Anyway, so slowly and surely, I slided into military history. And at one point, I decided, okay, I found out lots of things. Let us write some military history articles. And all of a sudden, I found out that people more interested about my military history products than my war studies products. And the book you are holding is one of my first book. And it is also the beginning of my serious interest into military history. So I ended up in Ottoman military history in a sense quite by chance. I would rather happy to deal with contemporary Turkish military issues or contemporary Middle Eastern conflicts, but with some luck or unluckiness, I ended up in Ottoman military history.
And they're quite fascinating to read. And the Ottoman Empire is really a fascinating empire to study.
Yeah, of course. I mean, one of the problems right now haunting the Ottoman history is the Ottomanists, the scholars, the historians, expert on Ottoman history. It's a small group of people, and they are not producing books and articles for general public, even the general historians. So they are producing products for their own use. So it's a very close xenophobic group, and this is one of my aim or target. I would like to make the Ottoman military history part of the global military history. Nowadays, Ottoman Army, Ottoman Armed Forces, and Ottoman military history treated as something unusual, bizarre. So all the lessons and experiences not useful for global military history, which is, according to me, nonsense. And when a Western military historian or a reader would like to learn an ordinary information, it is nearly impossible to get this information. They need to learn Turkish, they need to read 4 or 5 books in order to get a paragraph long information.
And I think very few people would actually dedicate themselves to actually do that, go that far just to learn a few paragraphs.
Yes, of course. I mean, that is the reason most of the military historians unable to make use of the Ottoman military history, because even the simple information not readily available, and that is one of the reasons I have written down that book.
So let's start with some of the branches, and of course one of the most famous, and like you said, that I think you stated in the book as well, that the army is the very backbone of the empire. And let's start with the Janissaries. So and I want to ask you actually, because the Janissaries is arguably one of the most famous parts of the empire. But what many people may not know is that the Seljuks actually originated as a sort of Janissaries, but again they rebelled. And of course that's how we get the famous Seljuk Empire. So why did the Ottomans succeed with the Janissaries, unlike what the Seljuk Turks did?
Well, the Ottoman military system was a combination of Islamic Middle Eastern military system plus the nomadic military tradition coming from Central Asia, plus Byzantine and East European military traditions. So the Ottomans blended these 3 diverse military tradition and created something unique. So if you delve into any Ottoman military institutions, including Yenicheries, you will find out the originating ideas from different military traditions. For example, Yenicheries was a military slave corps and conventional infantry, but all of them military slaves. So the idea of military slaves born in the Islamic military system. So during the Abbasi period, the Abbasids, several caliphates created armies out of the military slaves, and initially they made use of the local sources. Later on they imported slaves from the Caucasus or Central Asia. So the military slave institution was there in the geography already. The Ottomans converted this institution into something viable and better for them. And one of the shortcomings of the Islamic military slave system, you always depended upon importing slaves from distant lands. So the Ottomans initially tried to make use of prisoners of wars, transform them into Janissaries, but it didn't work well. So they decided to create the infamous devshirme method. That means getting sons from the Christian Balkan nations, mainly the Serbs, Croats, the Bulgarians, and at an early age, of course, and having them train in a very long period of time, transforming their bodies and minds and culturally transforming them into Muslim Turks. Although these Yenicheries never forget about their origins, and we know from some famous examples like Sokulu Mehmet Pasha, they return back to establish connection with their family members, and Sokulu Mehmet Pasha, by becoming the Great Wazir, he managed to construct some bridges, public facilities for his fellow mates in his origin hometown. But So the idea of military slavery, the Ottomans got it from the Islamic armies, Islamic military tradition, and transform it according to the sources available to them. And if we pay attention, forget about the military slavery side, but pay attention to the professional infantry soldiers. That was the first after the Romans. So professional infantry corps was something reinvented by the Ottomans many years before the famous Spanish tercios or the Dutch infantry, etc. So that is one of the things that I try to highlight in my book, because this is important for the global military history also.
And not only that, as you mentioned in the book as well, that if a janissary were to die, they would provide health care, I believe, and they would provide for the families for the fallen janissaries as well. So they had sort of a healthcare system.
That's correct. I mean, when you create a professional corps, you need to provide lots of benefits to make it work-wise for the soldiers. I mean, although these are technically military slaves, but they are not in chains. They are free to do lots of other things, but they remain in love slaves of the Sultan. So this is an army having their loyalty to the Sultan himself, no other people, no other institutions. The system constructed in such a way that there is a personal loyalty to the Sultan, and the Sultan always did his best to make his elite soldiers happy, giving them retirement benefits, and the janissaries regularly collected money from their members and they invested in the economy. So it is very early type of the capitalist system in the Ottoman Empire also. And janissaries always took care of the fallen members, kids, family, elderly janissaries. In addition to receiving pension, they had some rights to continue living in the military barracks by providing some simple duties. So this is a wholly very advanced system. Of course, you need to compare the janissary system with the contemporary cause in Europe or in the Middle East in order to understand how well developed the system was.
And how effective was the janissary corps? We talked about that they were well trained, but were they effective when it came to the actual battles and sieges?
Well, until the 16th century, janissaries was an elite unit. So when you talk about elite, that means their numbers are limited. So until the 16th century, their numbers never reached the ceiling of 30,000 or something. So we are not talking about ordinary line infantry. We are talking about an elite unit. And this unit, well-disciplined, well-trained, under very effective command and control, and additionally, they're able to make use of not only the firearms, but they can also make use of bow and arrows. They are very good archers. And this is something very important because the early firearms, very slow, primitive, and it was difficult to hit the targets, and that was the reason you have to fire together, a volley fire. So the janissaries, in addition to the firearms, they can able to use bow and arrow, good archers, so they can hit targets 75 meters, and in a minute, a Janissary can able to launch 10 arrows, aimed arrows. In a minute, with the primitive rifle, you can only fire, if you are lucky, one. Most often, in 2 minutes, you're able to fire one shot. And if you're able to hit a target at 25 meters, you are very lucky. Janissaries, very good infantry, but an elite corps, that means they need to work with the mass infantry and cavalry. So the Ottomans generally make use of Janissaries at the center with a system in German called Wagenburgers, in Turkish called tabur. So the system, the Ottomans borrow it from the Hungarians, and Hungarians borrow it from the Czech, two sides. So Wagenburg system means you have specially constructed war wagons, and in the battlefield, you connect these war wagons, create a kind of a fortress-like structure. In the wagons, you have some firearms, big ballista-type weapons, kinetic weapons, and the Janissaries waited the enemy behind the Wagenburg line. So when the enemy approached, the enemy had to face the Wagenburg formation, this mobile fortress formation, and when the time is right, the Janissaries overpassing this line and attack the enemy lines. The Ottomans perfected this Wagenburg system by making use of the cavalry at the right and left wing, forcing the enemy units canalized towards the Wagenburg formation, and the Janissaries, after tiring down the enemy with the fires from the Wagenburg formation, overpass the formation and start firing. And in that sense, the tactics and techniques of Janissaries, we do not have enough information, but what we have from the information we are getting from the battlefields, I mean, the Swiss infantrymen use pikes, long pikes, to defeat the cavalry. They were tactically very mobile, but when they try to move from one battlefield to another place, they had to depend upon other transportation things. So strategically, the pikeman formation not very mobile. The Ottomans instead make use of Wagenburg formation, which is strategically mobile, but tactically not that much. I mean, you can move the Wagenburg in a battlefield, but their movement capacity is very slow. And by using this formation, the Ottomans able to achieve quite important battlefield victories up until the 16th century. So what happened in 16th century? Massive use of firearms. So the Ottomans, in order to fight their enemies, had to increase the number of the Janissaries. So after the 16th century, the numbers of the Janissaries rises up, and it reached nearly 100,000 personnel. And by becoming more, the Janissaries sacrificed their elite characters and transformed into line infantry.
So the Janissaries are, of course, not the only branch of military the Ottomans had, and we don't have to talk about some of the other ones as well, like who were the Capokulo Corps?
Sorry, can you?
I don't know if I said it correctly, but the Capokulo.
Capokulo.
Yeah, yes, that's correct. Yes.
Yeah, Capokulo is Janissaries part of the Capokulo system. So Capokulo's military slaves, Janissaries, the infantry corps. There is the Capokulo Cavalry, the cavalry part of this system. We have the artillery, we have the ordnance sections, and we have even bombardiers within the Capokulo system. So the Capokulo system include the Janissaries, but because the Janissary is more numerous and more famous, the other branches of the Capokulo not known much. For example, the Capokulo Cavalry is an elite cavalry unit, specially tasked to protect the Sultan, the commanders, and they are specially trained to hit the enemy army at the last moment, giving them the final strike against the enemy forces. And the artillery later on, after 16th century, gained much importance with the improvement of the firearms, with the introduction of new cannon types and ability to have more mobile portable cannons. And the other branches generally play more minor roles, like the bombardiers. They were separate from the artillery corps. They gain importance during the 18th century, but before that, it's a very small group of soldiers. And we have also the ordnance corps providing the weapons, maintenance, ammunition to the Janissaries, the cavalry, and the artillery units. So all of them called Capokulo ocakları, and at the same time, all of them military slaves. The best of them selected for the Janissary corps, the second best for the cavalry, and worst candidates ended up in ordnance corps. To be selected for cavalry, you need to be a Janissary, show your valors and success, and then you may able to get promoted to the cavalry corps of the Capokulo.
And of course, the next branch is, of course, the artillery, which we don't have time to go through all the branches of the Ottoman Army, unfortunately, because we have to go through other top areas of the Ottoman Empire as well. But that's the other two more branches we don't go through before we go to part two, the sieges. And let's start so let's go to the next one, which is the artillery. So how did the artillery work in the Ottoman system?
Well, the artillery first introduced to the Ottomans thanks to capturing some weapons from the Balkan armies. And it looks like at that time, we are talking about 1420s, 1430s. It looks like at that time it was possible to hire foreign experts to cast cannons and to use them. Because at that time, when you are talking about artillery, you need to pay attention. The same guys also dealing with the production of the cannons and then using them. In Europe at that time, there was a special military engineering families, mostly Italian originated, keeping their know-how secret within their family and solving for different foreign masters with, of course, profit. The Ottomans initially hired European military experts, but later on they managed to train, educate their own artillery experts, casting the cannons, production of the black powders, and using them effectively. So in order to use the artillery effectively, the Ottoman sultans created a special artillery corps under the Capokulo system and used military slaves to do that. And these people received a special, very long-term training, and depending upon their abilities, some of them used for the production of the cannons, the others used in ordinary artillery roles. So the Ottomans had the advantage of their own military engineers to deal with the big problem of using the artillery effectively. Whereas in Europe, until the time of 18th century, the Europeans had to depend upon military engineering families to receive this artillery expertise. The Ottomans, in comparison to their enemies, created mobile foundries. So the Ottomans, instead of carrying large artillery pieces with them to the siege, they able to cast the cannons on site at the siege site. So this gave them unique ability to deal with difficult castles on top of the mountains, etc. Because most of the time you spend large effort to bring the cannons and ammunition to the siege site. The Ottomans most often cast their cannons on site and use them effectively. Another important element of the Ottoman success was the engineers.
Perhaps one of the most famous engineers is Urban, the Hungarian.
Sorry?
Perhaps one of the most famous engineers of the Ottoman times is Urban, the cannon engineer who made the cannon for the 4053. Urban, perhaps, yes.
The
I'm going to say a lot
guy.
of names wrong here today, so forgive me.
Urban served in 1450s. The Ottoman cannons gained big importance during the 16th century. So 50 years later than Urban. And the Ottomans able to create their own military engineers by using different nations under the Ottoman umbrella. The Ottoman system is an empire. An empire was successful if the empire able to tap the unique specialties of the subject nations. For example, in a siege, in addition to artillery, you need combat engineers, you need sappers, you need additional engineers to dig tunnels to reach under the castle walls, explode them, or to make use of the big open spaces, develop them, etc. So the Ottomans initially made use of simple workers, miners, working in the Balkan mines. And one of the neglected aspect of the siege of the Constantinople was having Serbian miners digging under the walls, causing the destruction of the walls. So the Ottomans essentially made use of lots of things. And for example, the Vauban's famous line of conservation, the siege tactics of the French engineer Vauban, actually created during the Ottoman period also. The Ottomans created zigzag trenches, the Ottomans created the famous parallels around the castles to reach the castle without suffering huge casualties. So the problem with the Ottoman system depend upon oral tradition. So the Ottoman military was not well fond of writing down their experiences. The Ottomans, up until 18th century, never produced military manuals. So the Ottoman system depend upon oral culture, on-the-job training, very laboursome, but at the end, you're able to teach the new generation all the information you have. This oral tradition, unfortunately, left very few things. And that is why we need to make use of archaeology, battlefield archaeology. We need to make use of modern metallurgy to examine the Ottoman cannons, Ottoman firearms, to understand the level of their technology.
And of course, the last, before we go to take a look at the few sieges that you as well mentioned in the book, with the Irregular Army, then perhaps the infamous Irregular Army, and I'm probably going to say the name wrong again, or as you call it, the Basibukas, is that correct?
Sorry?
Basibutas, the irregular army.
You mean auxiliary corps?
No, not
no,
exactly.
no,
Let
no,
me try
başıbozuk
to.
you mean.
Yes, that's it. That's it. Yes.
Başıbozuk.
I'm gonna say a lot
Başıbozuk.
of main names wrong in this episode, so.
Yeah, I mean, başıbozuk is the irregular troops or auxiliary troops named after 18th century. So previously they had different names depending upon their uses, depending upon the type of weapons they are using or the geography they are coming. But after 18th century, these irregular groups, some of them volunteers, some of them mercenaries, attached to the conventional army, named başıbozuk. That means because they didn't have uniforms, they didn't have established command and control system, and during the battles, they generally acted without discipline, without control, and that was the reason why they were called başıbozuk. So başıbozuk means without having an effective commanders, officers. So the başıbozuks became the darling of the Western observers because these guys wearing very colorful outfits like the outfits of the German mercenaries during the early modern period. Remember, the German mercenaries also loves to wear very colorful outfits, and the başıbozuk also wear colorful outfits. They were soldier of fortunes, dedicated their life for soldiering, for profit, and most often they came with some ladies, some of them their wives, some of them prostitutes, etc. So these are all very interesting thing for the Western observers. So especially in 19th century Western observers, you learn many things about the başıbozuk, but the same Western observers pay limited attention to the conventional infantry and cavalry of the Ottomans. So you got the feeling as if the Ottoman army did not have any conventional troops, but only başıbozuks, all these irregulars.
So let's go to part 2 of this episode, which is we're going to go a little bit back in time and start with the Siege of Bursa. And I think you said that it took 8 years to capture the city. So what took so long? Because they didn't really at the time have any trebuchet or heavy artillery at the time. So wasn't it difficult for the morale, considering it took about 8 years to capture Bursa? Wasn't it difficult with the morale and etc. to does it give up easily?
At that time, you are talking about the early period of the Ottoman state, not empire, but a small emirate at that time. And the Ottomans did not have regular infantry corps. So you have most of your soldiers light cavalry, and as you know, light cavalry simply useless for siege purposes. And you have some irregular infantry elements. If you do not have regular infantry, you cannot conduct a siege. Plus, the Ottomans at that time, forget about artillery, no artillery at that time, but also they suffer difficulty to find combat engineers. So their solution was starving the cities. So they blockade the city all around. They constructed some small castles, towers to close down the ways heading to the city, and they wait. And one tactic that the Ottomans play a lot during this early period was, before the siege, frightening the villages around the city, forcing all the civilians to take shelter in the city, thereby increasing the population of the city. And when the siege started, the sources available in the city will disappear in a very short time, and the people in the end had to surrender. Why it took such a long time for Bursa, and we have other long sieges for another city nearby, Izmit, also very long siege. The Ottomans unable to seal the cities effectively. So these cities able to receive some food and some reinforcements, able to penetrate into the Ottoman line around the city, and that was the reason why these sieges took such a long time. And if the siege took such a long time, the Ottomans discovered that when you capture the city, most of the structures in the city of no use anymore. You have half-starved population. That means you have to invest a lot of money and you have to bring additional people to repopulate the city. So the Ottomans learned lots of things about this, and that was the reason why the Ottomans decided to create Janissary Corps, a regular infantry capable of not only fighting at the battlefields but also perform the siege duty.
And it wasn't a very effective way to siege a city either, I imagine.
Well, it depends. I mean, if you're able to starve the people, if you're able to frighten enough number of peasants taking shelter in a city, you may be able to capture the city in a short time. But the Ottomans initially, because they had light cavalry, irregular infantry, no engineers, so they couldn't capture the cities in a short time, and it looks like they have difficulty to blockade the cities effectively, an effective blockade.
And of course, there was a few sieges in between, but let's talk about of course. And if you want, you can check out the episode. I would highly recommend. We made an episode about this, about the Siege of Constantinople with Professor Roger Crowley. It's a fantastic episode, I believe. And let's talk about it here as well. So let's talk about the Siege of Constantinople a little bit.
Well, if you take a look at the readily available books in English, you get the impression that the Ottomans succeeded to capture the Constantinople thanks to availability of large bombards, huge cannons. I mean, the cannons, of course, play an important role for the fall of the Constantinople, but the real factors that the Ottomans able to capture Constantinople in 1453 was the Sultan Mehmed II. After capturing the Constantinople, he gained the nickname the Conqueror, in Turkish Fatih. So Mehmed II at that time, very young, 23, 24 years old, but he was very bright. He understood the military affairs.
At 19 years, I was hardly out of high school.
Sorry?
At 19 years, I was hardly out of high school.
Well, we are talking about completely different times, and you didn't born as a prince, I mean.
Yeah.
So Mehmed II was very bright, and he tried to understand the military technology also. He played a special role for the casting of mortars for the city. But another issue was the Byzantines able to find ways to deal with the cannons, these large bombards, because they are so large, they could not fire frequently. So there are 2-3 hours intervals after each balls hitting the walls. The Byzantines able to create earthen bastions, repair the walls. So in a sense, at some point, Mehmed II came to a deadlock because his cannons not serving the purpose. And that was the reason why he moved a portion of his navy on the hills, overpassing the Galata hills into Golden Horn, because the Byzantine walls at the Golden Horn weaker than the land walls. So Mehmet, by moving the real area of influence from the land walls to the Golden Horn, able to demolish the morale of the defenders, and because the defenders got frightened, they couldn't perform the effective defense against the cannons, and in the end, the Ottomans able to penetrate into the city. But don't forget, Mehmet II collected a huge army. So the numbers debatable, but we are talking about around between 70,000 to 100,000 soldiers all around the city. I mean, if you pay attention, the amount of food, the fodder, and other kind of things this army using, consuming every day, it's a huge logistical nightmare. I mean, things about one soldier consume a kilo of food every day. A horse consume 5 kilos of food every day. And you need to provide water, you need to provide sanitation, hygiene, to keep so thousands of people in a very narrow area.
Do you have any idea of number that Mehmet had in the Siege of Constantinople, or do you have?
Well, currently the debate is between 70,000 to 100,000. I think 70,000 is more reliable numbers, but of course, within this 70,000, we have also the numbers of the logistical elements, combat support service elements, cooking food, providing transportation, providing military labor, and other kind of things. So it's a very large undertaking. Mehmet II spent 2 years to prepare for this siege. He able to deal with probable problematic areas in the Balkans and Anatolia. He created alliances with the Genoese in order to balance the Venetian issue. So in addition to military affairs, Mehmet II also deal with the diplomatic issues. And like I said, he also spent quite a long time to prepare the necessary logistical base in order to launch this siege. And it was all in all remarkable affairs. But if you get into the details of the siege, a few turning points, Mehmet faced huge difficulties and he nearly gave up. But he able to continue on, and that was also one of the power of his leadership.
Which of course brings us to the next part when we talked about the logistics and payment. How did you go about financing? Because as we spoke about in the previous episode with Professor Virginia Aksan, we talked about that one of the taxes was from the Christians in order for them to be able, one of the main incomes for the empire was the Christian taxation for allowing them to practice their faith, which was common in the Islamic world. But that can't have been the only taxation for the empire, was it? There must have been other financial aids as well.
Well, the Christian tax, you mean poll tax?
Yeah,
was important, but not the most important revenue. The most important revenue was land tax. But we are talking about an economy not basing on cash. Okay?
Mm.
So you simply cannot collect money from the taxpayers. Peasants paid their taxes in kind. So they're able to give you grains, vegetables, animals, but no money. And that was one of the problem of all the Middle Eastern countries, Middle Ages period countries. All the Middle Age empires, kingdoms suffer from the same thing. until the Dutch Republic, the cash economy was not available. So when you collect taxes, for example, from Yemen, far away on the very distant corner of the empire, the peasants providing you grain, camels, sheep, etc., how can you transport them to the areas that you need? So you need to create an effective system, military administrative system, to transform these taxes into a military power. And this is what the Ottomans did by developing the old traditions that they borrowed from the Islamic countries, from the Byzantine legacy. They created Timaroid system. Timaroid system means you allocate lands to Sipahis. Okay, unlike the feudal European system, these Sipahis only had right to use the taxes. So they were not entitled to use the land as it belonged to them. The land belonged to the state allocate the tax revenue of certain lands to the Timaroid cavalry. So Timaroid cavalry was light cavalry, and depending upon the land allocated to them, they had to bring soldiers when the state asked for it.
So it was kind of a communism before it was communism, in a sense.
Not communism, but something within the tradition of the Roman Empire. Plus, you need to include the Islamic element into it. So land-based soldiers was not something the Ottomans invented. They simply developed these land-based soldiers into a better system. And because in-kind taxes, you cannot transport them in hundreds of or thousands of kilometers. So by creating military that could able to get the taxes on the site and create military units that the empire able to use them whenever it wants, something that was the biggest secret behind the military success of the Ottomans. And the same Sipahis also used for internal security duties. So during the peacetime, the Sipahis responsible of providing security of the region to people, the trade, protection of the roads, and other kind of services that the state needed. So they were not simply military personnel, but they were also, they had also some administrative duties. They had also some law enforcement duties. The Ottomans used the same system for the fortresses, because early modern period means thousands of fortresses, especially in Europe, against the Habsburgs, initially against the Hungarians, later against the Habsburgs. Hundreds of huge fortresses covering the area. So how can you feed the garrisons of these fortresses? How can you pay their salaries? And the Ottomans again make use of land allocations. So giving lands to the different members of the garrison. So these garrison members, by using the tax revenues of the lands allocated to them, they perform the services of defending the castle, providing administrative and law enforcement duties. The Ottomans only pay in cash their Capokulo corps, janissaries, and others. The auxiliary corps, the provincial cavalry, Timaroid cavalry, and other provincial troops all receive their salaries from the local taxes.
And this brings us to the next part, and we spoke about this again in the previous episode, but I want to bring it up again when we abolishing with abolishing the Janissaries, and we spoke about this before the returning, that absolute power corrupt absolutely, and the Janissaries at the time of Mahmud II, they're really corrupt. They're very irrelevant at this time, as you as well mentioned in the book. So how difficult was it to get rid? Because they kind of stood in the way to modernize and get an effective Ottoman army. So how difficult was it to abolish the Janissaries in Mahmud's time?
Okay, there's a special phrase called it Praetorian Guard. Praetorian Guard phrase born with the Romans. The Roman Empire face frequent soldier revolts because the very soldiers they train, equip, and pay the salaries from time to time rebel against the emperor, rebel against the government. And the Ottomans also suffer the same problems during the classical period. Although in terms of numbers, the Janissaries few, but they were very efficient elite corps, and they were located at the capital city and some important provincial centers. So they had immense power. But like the Roman Praetorian Guards, Janissaries never rebel alone. They're all rebellions united with the different political factions in the capital. So they always rebel with alliance with some important government figures, important pashas, generals, or important persons within the court. They never rebel alone. And when they rebel alone, their rebellions easily crash. The problem was after 16th century, when the numbers of the Janissaries increased, the rules and regulations controlling them had to be slackened. So previously, the Janissaries were not allowed to have family while in service. A Janissary only able to get married after retirement. But during the especially the second half of the 16th century, the Janissaries started to create families. Their numbers are increasing, and because their numbers increasing, the government had to pay the salaries in cash in comparison to provincial troops. The governments always got into economic crisis. And when they tried to solve the crisis, they devaluate the money, devaluation. And they made the devaluation by putting copper into the silver coins, so making the worth of the money less, or cutting some part of the coin, so making the amount of silver within the coin less. And this devaluation put the Janissaries into difficult condition, like any salaried person in modern economy. If there's inflation and if your money losing its value, what will you do? So the Janissaries initially rebelled, but later on they started to create, find new jobs in addition to soldiering. So during the peacetime, the Janissaries started to deal with opening small shops or working as daily laborers. So it transformed from a military corps into a kind of a social class. So the Janissaries all of a sudden transform into lower middle and upper lower class segments, small shop owners, daily laborers, and also receiving military salary. And with these issues increasing, the Janissaries also started losing their soldierly behavior and military effectiveness. And the governments suffered difficulty to mobilize the Janissaries for frequent military expeditions. So when they couldn't move the Janissaries out of the capital, they had to hire mercenaries. So with the failure of the Janissaries as a military corps, the government had to depend more to military mercenaries. And one thing that all the military mercenaries wanted in the Ottoman Empire, to get a place within the Janissary corps. So the governments, while mobilizing the mercenaries, promised them getting a place with the Janissary corps if the military expedition turned out to be success. So the Janissary numbers increasing, the Janissaries losing their soldierly qualities, transforming from a military corps into a socio-economic class. All of a sudden, we are having a huge problem for the sultans. So the Janissary is not necessarily very conservative. They simply would like to preserve their interests. They were receiving a salary, although small, but it was important for them to survive within the Ottoman economic system. And they had their families, they had civilian jobs, and they would like to protect their prestige and privileges, because being a Janissary means the ordinary law enforcement could not bother you. You have protection against the ordinary law enforcement, and this gives you an advantage in the economy and in the social life. So starting from especially 1730s, we are not seeing Janissaries as a military corps, but a privileged social class, especially located in Istanbul, the capital city, but also the provincial centers, because in order to protect these sites, the Ottoman government sent different Janissary garrisons to the provincial centers, and these Janissaries remained there throughout all the time, and they transform into a local group. So in addition to Janissaries in Istanbul, there were Janissaries in all the big provincial centers.
And the abolishing of the Janissaries was quite brutal as well.
Well, that was the Ottoman system. The Ottomans were not good reformers. When one military corps unable to fulfill its roles, the Ottomans, instead of abolishing and creating a completely new system, they preferred to create a new corps next to the old corps and waited the old corps to die away. We see the examples from the very beginning, from the foundation of the Janissary corps, for example. Before the Janissaries, the Ottomans had a special corps called Yaya, that means infantry. And instead of abolishing the Yaya, the Ottomans founded Janissaries, waited the Yaya losing their combat effectiveness, and then moved the Yayas into combat service support roles, using them for transportation or logistical purposes. So the Ottomans, very conservative in terms of keeping the military institutions intact as long as it lasted. So when Selim III decided to create a new corps, instead of dealing with the Janissaries, Selim III created a separate military corps and hoped that the new corps transform into a strong unit, so that by using the strong unit, he could able to deal with the Janissary problem completely. It turned out to be not the good way to do it, and Selim III was killed during that period. Mahmud II, the Sultan after the Selim III, used a different system. He created lots of local alliances, including alliances with different military corps, and then he get rid of the Janissaries bloodily, in a very bloody way. He tried to kill all the Yenicheris he managed to capture. Okay, the Janissaries, don't forget, at that time in 1826 was a social group. So you are not destroying only a military corps, but you are also destroying a social group within the capital city, Istanbul. It was a huge bloody bath for the city. Thousands of people got killed, some of them innocent, but Mahmud II found no other way but to eliminate them all. But Mahmud made a big mistake by thinking that provincial Janissary corps were also the same type as the ones in Istanbul. So when he moved to eliminate the provincial Janissary corps, it caused big rebellions, especially in Bosnia. And instead of increasing the security of the empire, it decreases the security of the empire, because this provincial Janissary corps serving some purpose, some military and law enforcement purposes in the provinces. Right. When you get rid of them, a huge void appeared in the provinces, and all of a sudden the Ottomans started to see lots of rebellions in the Balkans and the Arabian provinces. So the Ottomans waited too long to reform the Janissaries, and when they couldn't reform the Janissaries, they decided to eliminate them all in a very bloody way, and this caused a huge void within the empire, not only militarily but also in socio-economic ways. And the Ottomans had to suffer at least 50 years to fill the void.
Would you say that this is a time when the Ottoman military kind of become irrelevant after the abolishment of the Janissaries?
Well, when you get rid of your military army, you need to create a new one. So Mahmud II had to spend a lot of time to create a new army. But don't forget, while you are trying to create the new army, you are also facing foreign threats. I mean, don't forget, 1826, the abolishment, bloody end of the Janissaries, also the time period of the Greek independence war. The
Which is 200 years ago, actually.
Continue until 1827. And don't forget, in 1827-28, you got into a war with Russia.
The Crimean War.
And the Ottoman army is defeated, because at that time you didn't have an army. You have to collect mercenaries, provincial volunteers, etc. And don't forget, with the elimination of the Janissaries, you also eliminated your officer corps also. So you need to find officers to command these armies, and it took such a long time.
And unfortunately, the Ottomans didn't have the time because of all the wars going on in the empire. You had the Great Independence, the Crimean War, you had the Ottoman-Russian War. I don't know if that's the Crimean War. You had all these different types of things going on in the empire at the time.
Well, you know something, the Ottomans able to outlast some of their more stronger enemies, I mean. The Russian Empire ended in 1917. The Ottomans were still fighting. So the Ottoman Empire literally ended in 1922. And don't forget the Austria-Hungary, the famous Habsburgs, divided into small pieces well before the Ottomans. The Ottomans also overlasted their Persian enemies. And so to a certain extent, when you are looking to the last centuries of the Ottoman empires, pay attention not to use decline term a lot. I mean, although there were lots of wars during that period, and the Ottomans lost huge territories from time to time, but still the Ottomans able to provide peace and security to different parts of the empires. The Ottomans created a completely new army basing upon the European models. So these are not small successes. And when you are evaluating the Ottomans, pay attention to other non-European nations. What had happened to them? I mean, think about what is happening in India. Think about Persia, think about China. So the Ottomans turn out to be very successful in facing all the might of the Europe. Of course, they play the famous diplomatic game of that area, using one power against the others in order to survive series of crises. But this also shows the talent of the empire. And when the Ottoman Empire ended completely, for most of the territories in 1918, after the end of the First World War, for Anatolia in 1922. I mean, think about what happened in the Middle East after the Ottomans. Did Middle East find peace and security? No. And all of a sudden, the hated Ottoman period transformed into a period of peace for most of the lands. Of course, some regions frequently face military activities. I mean, the Hungarian lands of the Ottoman empires, in addition to big wars, Lange creeks, Klein creeks, small wars, always happening. That is also true for the Caucasus and the Persian frontiers. But think about the other parts of the empires. I mean, the other parts living under peace without big problems. So the Ottomans somehow managed to govern these lands effectively, able to tax the people, able to get the soldiers they are looking for, and also still preserve the peace. Because after you remove the Ottoman Empire from the geography, instead of coming more prosperity and peace in which the local people were hoping for, they face more wars, devastation, and lots of other terrible things. I'm not trying to make the Ottomans as wonderful good guys. I'm just trying to give the sense that the empire system works differently than a nation state.
So the Europeans didn't understand the Ottoman system. They didn't understand how it worked.
To understand the Ottomans, always think about the Romans, all these Mediterranean style empires. So Ottomans was the last Mediterranean empire. To understand the Ottomans, you need to understand the logic of the empire system, because in an empire, every individual had different layers of identity. So an ordinary individual would have a local identity, a regional identity, an ethnic identity, a religious identity, and an imperial identity. So something like a cake with different layers. So it is always difficult to identify the real identity of an individual. And that was the reason why at the end of the Ottomans, some people from the same family labeled themselves Turks. The other members of the family labeled themselves Arabs, depending upon the place, depending upon the fortune. And the same individual calling himself Ottoman, Turk, Kurd, Arab, depending upon the rise and the fall of the fortunes. So one thing very important, Ottoman Empire was not an extraordinary, unusual political entity. The Ottoman army was not an unusual, exotic army. The Ottoman army was a European army with its own identity, with its own colors, differences, etc. So when you get into the Ottoman military history, you need to consider the Ottomans always with the neighboring countries, with the contemporary military system in the same period. Otherwise, you could not understand the Ottomans. You could not understand the type of weapons they are using, because the same weapons used by other nations also. You could not understand some of the tactics and techniques. You could not understand how and why that particular military unit created and in the end destroyed. All this information blended with the time period and with the geography the Ottomans living. So we need to treat the Ottoman military history as a part of the global military history. Otherwise, we will end up in completely wrong places.
I also asked this question in episodes like this. What would you say is the conclusion of the Ottoman military?
Well, the Ottomans left legacy not only to the geography that the Ottomans control and conquer, but also the neighboring countries and also globally. So the Ottoman Empire was not unusual political entity. It was born from the Middle East, from the Balkans. It governed 3 continents: Eastern Europe, Asia, the Northern Africa. And because it was an empire, it managed to make use the potential of the subject nations. And during the age of the nationalism, as you can expect, the Ottoman Empire ended. But until the very last day, the Ottoman Empire still meant something to its citizens. They might not like the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottoman Empire still means something to them. But after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, the history of the Ottoman Empire and the history of the Ottoman military treated as a kind of a dark age, especially in the Balkans and also the Arab nations. They tried to forget about their Ottoman history, their recent history. Instead, they wrote down lots of books about their history before the Ottomans. So, luckily, after a century later, after 100 years, people start looking the Ottomans differently, not seeing the Ottoman period as a dark age. We need to discuss this issue openly with all the participants. Otherwise, we might stuck in one narrative, either painting the Ottoman Empire completely white or painting the Ottoman Empire completely in dark colors. None of these colors represent the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire was very colorful. It had a long life, nearly 600 years. So when you are talking about Janissaries, what period Janissaries you are talking about? Are you talking about the foundation period, the classical period, 17th century, or just at the beginning of 19th century? Because it's nearly 600 years. So when you are talking about the Ottoman cavalry corps, you need to specify the time period or the geography, because the Ottomans knew that under the new firearms, having light cavalry was useless. But it was useless in Europe. It still served to a purpose in the East against the Persians. In the Middle East, in the Arab lands, the cavalry is still playing an important role. the Ottomans did not have the luxury of two separate armies fighting in two different geographies. They had a single army fighting in the west, in the east, in the south. And in order to understand some of the expeditions, military expeditions, you need to understand the imperial mentality. Why the Ottomans went to Yemen and spent so much time and effort to keep the Yemen under their control. You need to understand the imperial logic. Otherwise, you may see it was completely useless to send soldiers far away in such a distant land. But according to the imperial logic, it worked to a purpose, because you are not talking about a nation state, you are talking about an empire with a special political frame and political aims.
Thank you so much for coming. It's been a pleasure to have you on. Before you go, do you have anything you want to promote? Where can people find your book? Anything you wish me to put in the description of the episode?
Well, if you have the will and time, we may discuss my new book in the next chapters, because in January 2002, a new book of me published by Routledge, and this is about the last period of the Ottomans, the Ottoman Army and the First World War. And this is a more detailed book, because the book we discussed today, a single volume, nearly 350 pages, covering the 600 years of the Ottoman Empire. So this book is just covering 4.5 years of the empire in relatively the same size, nearly 400 pages. So if you have the time and will, we may discuss my new
maybe in the next episode. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Erlend. This has been Well That Aged Well. We are available on Instagram and on Well That Aged Well. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. And please consider taking time to rate us on Apple Podcasts. It will be most appreciated. And write a little review if you took the time. It doesn't take much time. Please like, share, and subscribe. Next week, we will take a look at the history of nationalism. And I'll see you next time.